Hold on, my timer is lagging. Okay, starting my speech in three, two, one. I think that movements have to adapt to the current political climate for them to be able to appeal to a number of audiences and ensure that they have critical mass moving behind them and ensuring that they're able to put forward their political agenda and stuff like that. And we think this is most important for the civil rights movements in the context of the US right now, where we have seen individuals leaning into more conservative rhetoric to be able to appeal to people in power, for example, and just generally get moderates on their side. Because what does integrating look like? So it's not necessarily attaching themselves to religious institutions or figures exclusively. It's just a text that we're going to integrate at the moment. We're going to integrate it in messaging, speeches, campaigns, etc. We think that movements are strategic and rational anyways, so we're bound to use religious text that's probably going to help our cause and not become a detriment. This looks like co-opting the idea that all men are created equal being at the forefront of earlier movements in the past. We think this is different from status quo that attempts to completely secularize the fight for civil rights and appeal to pure reason or whatever and stuff like that, right? We think an example of this is like Martin Luther King being affiliated to some sort of religious institution and being able to use that to the advantage of the civil rights movements. Why is this the only extent in which we're willing to integrate religion into our movement at the moment? We understand that this comes with the risk of possibly alienating people who have felt betrayed by religion and stuff like that. And we also risk being seen as like regressive and stuff like that. But we think that it's not going to be an overnight static thing. We understand that movements are incremental and it's probably going to only be a stepping stone to establishing more strategic partnerships and affiliations that's strategic for pushing their agenda and ensuring that people are joining us on our side and stuff like that, right? What's your metric for supporting a strategy for a social movement to begin with, more specifically when it's the civil rights movements in the context of the US? We think that it's quite simple when it helps the movement with mobility in achieving their goal, which is probably looking like additional political power or ensuring that we have a critical mass moving in their favor, or we see by justice for violence and assault on the lives of and integrity of people of color, or like just generally reform on discriminatory policies and structures. And these things cannot be attained when we don't attach ourselves to some sort of to some when we don't attach ourselves to things like religion that has way more political capital in status quo compared to us right now, right? But first, a few preemptions. They might say that, oh, what if the religions you're getting these texts from see the movements as trying to co-opt their values? First, we think religious institutions aren't inherently critical towards civil rights movements because they don't necessarily see how these things are incompatible. But again, it's not an overnight thing, it's an incremental change that civil rights movements can work on to gain the trust of religious institutions or to be able to generate buy-in from them at least, right? So first case, why is the integration justified and therefore necessary, right? Let's answer the simple question of why religious text in the very first place, right? Because we think that religious text is probably symbolic and familiar for people that lean into these religions and are probably affiliated with more conservative rhetorics and stuff like that, right? But it's not something that people from that religion necessarily contest because it's dogmatic, but it can evolve, but it doesn't have the same burden of proof as more modern ideas like reason and stuff like that, right? It's generally something that people accept simply because they know that they know that this mechanism works, and it's something that they find comfort and solace from. We think that historically, religious narratives have been controlled and isolated among the white privileged majority in the US. That's why they're able to cherry pick scriptures, especially for religions that the majority subscribe to, like Christianity, and weaponize it against other social movements like the feminists and the BLM and stuff like that, right? We think that by integrating religious texts to our movement, the civil rights movement is able to do three things: co-op, reframe, and reclaim the narrative, right? On the first level, co-opting, we think that this shows that we can embody the same belief that we're not so different in our fight for human rights and stuff like that, that other rights is not a threat to their lives or status quo in general, because most hesitation and opposition to the plight of the civil rights movements is rooted from the fact that it feels too radical, it feels too separatist and reformist from what people are usually comfortable with right now, right? But secondly, we're able to reframe and shift the Overton window as opposed to constantly being portrayed as this negative force that's trying to disrupt everything that makes sense in America and stuff like that. But lastly, this is how we're able to reclaim the narrative because by co-opting it into our movement and constantly having discussions on these things, we're able to ensure that people of color are being included in these spaces as well. Because you have to understand that religious institutions, religious affiliations, stuff like that, are have massive political capital, especially in the US, as opposed to simply appealing to things like reason. Before anything, sure, oh.
Can you be a bit more precise? So which specific doctrines and denominations in, for example, Christianity are you going to include in your movement? Which leaders will you allow to give speeches, etc.?
We think that when integrating these things, we still have to make sure that they're in line with the things that the civil rights movements work for. So this probably looks like appealing to the idea that we all have equal rights, appealing to the idea that people deserve justice and stuff like that, or people deserve to live. We think that we're only allowing people from these religious institutions to give speeches when they're also already part of the BLM movement, because that's how we're best able to integrate these things. If in the future we want more speakers and stuff like that, more icons on our side, then that's a part of the process. This is only the stepping stone for that thing, right? We think in terms of integrating text, especially given that the majority of the US population, or maybe even the government, is pretty much showing trends of conservatism. We think that this is our way to appeasing to moderates and conservative religious individuals, because it bleeds into more additional political power, and we're able to appeal to their value systems. This generates more buy-in because we're able to attack a spectrum at its whole, right? Because we think that separation alienates a lot of people, and that's not something that we want to happen on our side, because at the very end of the day, more political capital, more individuals, more people participating in critical mass probably means that we're able to get rights more, that we're probably able to push for our agenda more in status quo, right? Like, even if there's no buy-in at the very worst case, it's okay because you get criticism from religious groups in opposition for being too separatist, for being too disruptive and stuff like that, right? We think civil rights movements don't exist in a monolith. All movements are probably multifaceted. So that's why peaceful protests and more violent revolts can coexist simultaneously. So this isn't going to drown out any of those narratives. These things are still able to coexist anyways. Thanks.
I'd like to thank
Please.
All right, I'd like to thank TDO for fine speech. Calling upon member of government to open the case on the lower bench. Here.
Hello, everybody. Could I please check if I can be heard?
Yep, you're audible. And just again, you confirm for recording.
All right, excellent. Yes, I know I'm being recorded. Please PY me in the chat. Yeah.
So let's go.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The main problem with the opening exchange is as follows. Opening government asserts that when you integrate religious texts, you will decrease the amount of antagonism from white people, essentially, and from racial majorities and the majority religion, with doing very little analytical legwork to show that the moment you as a Black civil rights movement start reading verses of the Bible to white people, they end up jumping into your movement. I think that if you read a religious text to a racist white person, they think that I think that opening opposition is already illustrated. They think that you are bastardizing their religion rather than really ingratiating yourselves to them. The lack of mechanism on this means that their impacts are speculative at best. At the same time, the opening opposition does not understand the specific context of religion in America. And that's exactly what closing government will give you, and will also mechanize for you how religion in particular helps Black communities. It's so significant to Black communities and it's so empowering for movements, and we'll explain why this helps civil rights movements in particular. These tangible benefits outweigh the speculative ideas from OG taking us over them, and engage directly with the auxiliary benefits from OO taking us over them as well. So firstly, on context, we think there are two important bits of context to give. Number one, America is, for the most part, especially among Black communities, Protestant. That's why you have Black pastors in America and Catholics in Europe and Asia. Well, it is important because historically speaking, this was because non-Catholics were literally fleeing the Europeans and moved into the New World, thus setting up Protestant churches. This is important because these religious structures are non-hierarchical, meaning to say you don't have to answer to white churches and answer to their particular interpretations of the religion. But secondly, religion in Black communities in particular is not privileged. They told you that you have to be a religious man and a pastor and you have to get a theological degree. Guys, black pastors are super poor. They are members of the community who are oftentimes just like extremely important in the communities as well. The fact that black communities in particular often rally around churches because it's a primary form of support, especially in times of especially in times of Jim Crow in the 1970s. That black churches are many and incredibly strong community centers for these individuals that galvanize hundreds of thousands of black people to go to them. Probably means that religion is not a privileged thing to access as a black person. But I will explain to you further why this empowers black people. No, thank you to that POI. So first thing the thrust of the extension is that religion empowers black people, and empowerment creates critical mass among people who otherwise will not show up for your protest. Why is the experience of racial oppression in particular inherently disempowering? We think that when you go through racial oppression, you lose a lot of choice in your life. You cannot choose things like where you live, for example, because of redlining. You cannot choose the school you go to because you cannot afford that many schools. You cannot make a lot of choices in your life. This probably means that you're alienated from ideas of the Constitution. Because what has the Constitution done to you? Your family was shot and your dad was in prison, right? You also are oftentimes alienated from ideas of human rights. What are abstract ideas of human rights ever done for you as a person? But furthermore, you deal with a lot of danger and suffering. As a black man, you cannot walk home at night. What this ultimately means is, as an individual, you're oftentimes placed in states of danger and you're placed in states of fear. What are the consequences of this to how individuals act? This is incredibly disempowering, and they feel that they cannot make choices in their own lives, especially political choices. When every part of your life is determined by white people, the odds of you as an individual being able to fight against them is extremely low. What happens therefore? This means that they don't do things like show up to protest, for example, when they think that it's only something that will get them further in danger because they're already so afraid. When there are individuals who often don't end up showing up to vote, because what's my vote going to do in a system which oppresses me, right? This ultimately means that, especially in America, when voting lines are super long because of voter manipulation, you don't end up being able to, or don't ever feeling that empowerment that forces you to put in the effort to vote, to fight for your own rights. What this ultimately means is civil rights movements in particular historically have been often had trouble galvanizing large swaths of black populations. Even though black people are such a massive group in America, they're not able to get that level of traction. Therefore, how then has religion, historically speaking, and in the present day, been inherently empowering to civil rights movements? We point you to, we would argue that given the massive role that religion plays in black communities in particular, oftentimes black pastors are getting massive amounts of political and social capital from their role as black pastors. You oftentimes are able to touch people in ways that they're already socially involved in, right? So that you as an individual already go for 8-hour churches, already go for barbecues of your parents or your people who go to church, who oftentimes are strong community centers. All of this ultimately means is the point at which civil rights movements are able to speak to people in a language they understand. Is the point at which you're able to galvanize that level of involvement in the black communities. Opening government is problematic because they tell you they want to appease to white people. Guys, we barely have black people on our side, given how tragic a life of a black person is and how unlikely you are to be able to get them to politically mobilize. We think that their ideas are our ideas are a priori to theirs and take us so far above them in this debate. But before I go on to explain why,
Protestants aren't perfect either. A lot of them are pro-life. A lot of them have complicated relationships with
police.
police.
Oh yeah, excellent. I understand what you mean. I'll talk about that later. Yeah, that's all in my case. Don't worry. So I'll engage. Don't worry. Yeah. Anyway, so we would argue that therefore, on a community level, we get that level of emotional support. But secondly, we also have religious narratives that specifically empower you as a person. You are a valued child of God. Historically, you have been religious oppression has happened in the past. Read the Bible, guys. We would point you to the examples of literally Jesus telling individuals that we will fight against the Romans. We literally have individuals like the Jews having been oppressed for thousands of years. The Bible is fraught with all of these ideas which historically can be used to galvanize and used to parallel to the present day. Therefore, you as an individual can find hope that other people have gone through slavery too. Other people have gone through oppression too and fought over it using religious narratives to galvanize the level of support, particularly among black communities. What then will people do to act? This means that individuals are more likely to show up and protest. This means they're more likely to put in the effort to vote. This means that they're more likely to donate money, even though they might not get it back for the sake of individuals around them, because Christianity and oftentimes religion has a level of galvanizing effect. Therefore, now that's going to get so much benefit for individuals. Therefore, now I'm going to engage. Don't worry, yeah? Here's where it is, responding POI. So, the main thrust of the opening opposition case is twofold. Number one, that you shut out individuals of different religions and denominations. Guys, Methodists do not hate Seventh-day Baptists more than they hate racists, right? We will say that individuals oftentimes can unite around civil rights movement even if they don't come around the same denomination. Similar to atheists, right? Even I as an atheist realize that probably the civil rights movement has other arguments which I really buy into, like I shouldn't get shot by the police. Therefore, we don't think it's very likely that you as an individual will pick your racists over the religious people, given that the racists are shooting you. We think that that's an untrue argument to make from the opening opposition. But secondly, they argued that we will hurt our ability to fight for certain causes. We disagree. We think that particularly Protestantism has the ability to reinterpret religious texts, especially black pastors who know that oftentimes power structures can be brought to question by the virtue of them being black and having been oppressed. Therefore, we can do things like literally reinterpret the Bible, and these are often individuals who are much more willing to do so because they are racial minorities, right? And oftentimes, like, they have experiences of oppression. Therefore, the fact that the Bible doesn't actually mention abortion, the Torah explicitly permits abortion. The Quran has no mention of abortion as well. Probably means that on our side of the house, civil rights movement can change their tune and change their ability to fight for the sake of progressivism as a movement as a whole. The closing government gives you mechanisms, we give you tangible benefits, and we can give you empowerment. So proud to take this debate.
I'd like to thank the member of cabinet for that fine speech. Calling member of OP. Here.
I'm just gonna assume that my audio is working.
Can I say something?
Hi, is this better? Does my audio work like this?
Yeah, this is good. This is good.
All right, perfect. TJ, no preference for pronouns. Put PYs in the chat. Preference for opening for diagonal engagement, but if not, closing is fine as well. Starting in 3, 2, 1. All teams in this debate accept that the most important question in the round is who best able to create social change. In closing opposition, we will provide the strongest mechanism to create those things. Therefore, even by just sheer weight of the impact, we're going to win this debate. So I just want to point to one thing extraneously from the closing government, because a lot of their analysis comes to rely upon religious ambiguity, right? Like the previous speaker I quote, abortion is not explicitly mentioned in the Bible, which doesn't deal with the reality that the power structures built around religious organization is like opposed instance in antagonism to those things. So it does not matter whether the Bible says abortion is a bad thing or not. People in religion oppose it in the status quo, which is why you adopting and co-opting religious rhetoric necessarily has to find a way to justify and reconcile it in this round. And I think that the opening opposition has already given sufficient reason as to why it is going to be impossible for you to do it either way you slice it. Further responses will be when I weigh the impact of social change to be greater in closing opposition. So in opening opposition, you get three things actually. The first is that it's harder to call out religious organizations if you're actively trying to work with them and co-opt their support. The second, you have an obligation to the most vulnerable people in that movement that is likely to be lost out. The third is that you're going to get less buy-in from religious communities, calling out opening government for not inculcating religious rhetoric to the greatest extent if they really wanted to get that specific support. In closing opposition, we think there are many reasons why advocacy does or does not work. But the biggest determining factor is to whether or not advocacy is successful is your ability to galvanize your followers to do things, right? To participate in protests, to donate your money, to engage in like lobbying a politician, right? All of these things require time, sacrifice, and commitment that most people would rather spend their time at home and not actually go out and engage in advocacy. The biggest enemy of social change has always been religion. And the biggest factor this is like the long-standing traditional norm that has stood against the empowerment of African Americans because the church used Bible to justify slavery. They've opposed the queer community, they've opposed feminist rights, and other things like that. The biggest thing that religion has to offer movement is to be the face of evil. The biggest reason for people to engage in activism and create social change. This just beats opening opposition outright because all think that movement can coexist alongside religion, although historically that has never been proven to be the case. But also the value of social movement as a safe space depends on the ability for that movement to preserve that safe space and empower and create progressive change so that that safe space can be empowered outward, because I don't think it's fair to say that movements are the only place, like there are queer people everywhere and the movement cannot protect all of them. The only real way to protect all of them is to create structural change in society. I'm first going to explain how necessary the process of demonization works, and then I'm going to explain why the impact is so significant that it outweighs both opening opposition and the gov bench. So it probably looks like the demonization of religion, like calling out problematic aspects of religion, right? Things that churches and conservative people support. So for example, it just looks like the church being very in support, being pro-life, for example, and evidenced by the context of the US where Roe v. Wade was just overturned by conservative Supreme Court justices. It looks like churches that oppose gay marriage, even though it has been legalization. The discrimination that is faced within them, the opposition to feminist movement, the opposition to the empowerment of women leaders, for example, the access to contraceptive, access and all the things like that. Within the context of the US, right, conservative justices overturned Roe v. Wade, primarily supported by the evangelical vote empowering the Republicans. Majority of people, given that religion and politics politics often intersect in the context of the US, I think it's easy to point to the various ways that evangelical Christians in the US have supported regressive bills pushing back against progressive movements and the change that they were able to create in society. The impact of this is a few things. The first is that you're on the outside of the house uniquely, you're able to use religion as to be the face of evil, allowing movement to point to them, like the visceral realities that push the BLM to violence, creating the most change that African Americans had in the past 10 years, was contingent of dependent on them having a face to that evil, something to fight against. That is the police department and the violence that have been done to African Americans for generations or the past few decades. We think the same way movements and civil rights in the US, a civil rights movement in the US, can use religion as the face of evil, to bastardize it and point to them as the reason as to why all these things are problematic and happening in society, which I think is, if you look at history, is true in the majority of cases. And for that reason, I think that trying to co-opt religious narrative necessarily takes this away from you, which means you lose the ability to galvanize your voters and galvanize your supporters to actually engage in things like activism, actually engage in things like donation, take the time out of the day to participate in protests against things like Roe v. Wade, for example, because these are the things that these are the things that is necessary to create social change. The absence of this ability to galvanize your followers means that the likelihood of change is massively reduced in the gut bench. The second thing we'll say is that putting a face on that extrinsic source of evil, for example, by villainizing religion, you're able to unify the movement, right? Especially the various sects within the movement. I think OG is correct to say that social movements are not a monolith, but also because there are various different parts of the movement, they have a tendency of trying to fight with each other. Like the LGBT and the T group, for example, there's always conflict about whether T should be part of the LGBT group. We think that putting a face to this evil and bastard and villainizing religion is more likely to incentivize people within this movement to put their differences aside and unify against religion and fight against this specific change. You get a lot more activism, a lot more donations, and all these things are significantly important and beats out the impacts in opening opposition because it don't have a positive way to galvanize change in this specific debate. I'll engage OG at this point.
Everything you said so far works for OG because we proved how conservative religious people in power think. They pander to palatable messaging, but you have yet to engage with the tangible policies we get as compared to the emotional support of CG, which is a tangential benefit.
Yeah, look, your religious leaders will not succumb to palatable messaging for the reason they're not going to succumb to any kind of messaging in your world. The only way things are going to change is through force and violence and pressuring them and forcing them to change in this debate. That's specifically what you get in closing opposition. So I don't think you get positive change in your world. How does this weigh in the debate? The first thing is against opening opposition. I've already proven we have the greatest scale of impact because the demonization aspects is able to positively galvanize change. Opening up points to existing capital that could be lost, but in closing opposition, we point to the higher likelihood of change because the ability to positively acquire change. The second is the principal duty of the movement is firstly empower under our side, because if we have the increased likelihood of creating change, we have the increased ability to protect those various minorities. But second thing is that I just think that the ability to change things for the future and protect future generations is a lot more important than the people now, because there's just a lot more people that can come in the future and harm can be prevented there. In weighing against opening government, just very little impact in the OG's case here. They attempt to co-opt religious support, but it's likely going to be unsuccessful because the strategic utilization of religious rhetoric is a recipe for failure. I think opening up's already disproven the efficacy in opening up. Moderate people that already buy into your movement in the status quo are going to support us on the outside, but demonization provides additional and greater capital for change for moderate, right? Because moderates can say we're being demonized on our side. We need to change this religion right now. Better still, for those moderates to leave the religion, peel off and stop supporting the religion. But in the worst case where we lose them, it is unclear the value that moderates have. You're not going to put a poke on your side of the house. These people are unable to change the structure that religion and the problem that religion has. For all of those reasons, closing opposition.
I'd like to thank the member for that fine speech. Calling upon government whip. Here.
Yeah, you're muted now.
Hi, I'm not.
Oh, sorry, I'm gonna move my chair.
Yeah.
Yeah, just take a listen.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Hi, you're audible.
Great.
Also, if it's not an issue, could you please wait for 2 minutes? I just need to change my network if that's fine.
Do that.
All right, thank you so much. I'm so sorry.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, you're audible. Good to go.
Cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. I just want to point out the very important framing that Ian actually talks about that never gets responded, right? And that is the framing that the movement itself and other atheists in general who don't participate in religion are not mutually exclusive. If the wording of the motion was this House supports civil rights movement in the US integrating art into like their advocacy, right? It doesn't remove scripture, it doesn't remove books, it doesn't remove speeches. This cuts out a lot of the OO and CO material to the point in which a lot of it is you exclude people who are atheists. Yes, there are other narratives as well, so a lot of the material doesn't stand. A few things therefore from this frame. The first is let's take down CO, then I unpack my extension, then I will whack OO and very, very nicely. Firstly on CO. First thing they say is that the church is very white and they have justified racism. Brilliant. Evangelical things still exist. The counterfactual of not co-opting religion is not the fact that it disappears. It's the fact that it continues unfettered and unchecked. America will still be white and Judeo-Christian. America will still continue to be white and Judeo-Christian and will still use the Bible for this, like, to justify stuff, right? The counterfactual is that we have black churches and queer churches saying that's not what the Bible intended for you to like interpret it as. You should love thy neighbor as you love thyself. Like Jesus like hung out with the prostitutes and like hung out with like the disabled, right? Like all of these things is then the counterfactual on our side of the house, right? This is important because not only does OP not solve their own problem, but then to the point in which to the point in which that they don't solve their own problems also when it continues to worsen as a result. Second, CEO's frame is that we should just bash religion because it's nice to bash. Firstly, it doesn't engage with the fact that like of what Ian tells you, which is that a lot of African American and queer people are religious. They do engage with God. They do like the Bible because it does preach things like equality. To bash religion as a whole, that's two things. The first is that it reduces the buy-in because if you buy like Ian's frame that a lot of them are religious, none of them are going to join your movement, guys. The second auxiliary harm is that it harms minority religions like Islam because one of the main weaponizations, unfortunately, and the main infighting within the religious, within the civil rights movement as a whole, is that sometimes Muslims or hijabis are seen as conservative, right? Are seen as people who are not liberal, who are like entrapped within their own religion. The issue with that, therefore, is that you also harm the weaker part that the civil rights movement wants to protect, guys. So you cannot bash religion as a whole because not only is it popular within minorities, you also hurt minorities. It's a double jeopardy. What is like Ian's extension, therefore, right? Is the fact that within these communities, right, there's a trend in America, right, poor communities, religion tends to be quite popular because of what God entails and what the Bible ensures, right, which is you as an individual are worthy, you are like servants of God. More importantly, if you don't buy that frame, more importantly, right, like this is just the important frame essentially, right? Why is there no cohesion in status quo therefore, right? Firstly, I think there's like Ian talks about the minority hate within communities. The issue of intersectionality means like things, for example, colorism means that Black Latinas are excluded from the Latina community. Things like immigration means African American people don't like Latinas. The main thing here is that religion bands these people together because I as a Black person, you as a Black Latina person can then bond together and say, hey, we are both Christian, we are both like Catholic, we're both Catholic, and we both believe in the same values. The second is, I think more importantly, the fatigue that exists when trying to fight in the civil rights movement. The reality is grim, sad, and dreary. If, like on the other side of the house, they want to use logic and use all of these things, I as a Black voter am tired. I as a Black voter see the structural things that constantly infringe on my rights, and I don't want to vote anymore, because what's the damn point? I think here is when firstly, right, the integration of how God specifically helps you fight is then important. Because fighting oppression is something that God wants. God is a being that encourages you to appeal to your religious duty, right? Even if there's quote unquote no tangible benefit. The fact that Moses said, let my people go to the let my people go to the slaves, right? To ensure that like they get out of there, to help the disadvantaged and the poor, is your duty as like an individual for a bigger collective, right? This is important because not only is it God a unifying force, it's a driving force for you to continue to change, right? I think that like independent of that, you don't bother as a result because of the cold, hard, grim realities of the truth. Versus OG, the let thereof of a frame of involvement is kind of like a frame of involvement kind of means that like you don't tackle the main stakeholder of this debate, which is like minority people, and therefore no change. But the frame of trying to change white people is giving me like, I'm trying to change, like I can change him, you know, like it's giving abusive boyfriend, like, oh my God, I can change him, right? Like, it's just not very viable, huh? Versus OO, the issue here is that it's the whole frame is that it's very exclusionary. Here's where I tackle OO. But before I move on, yeah, I'll take you. OO, what you want?
Oh, you haven't proven exclusivity. We gave you 4 alternatives that lead to better policy and are much less likely to lead to you making a theological faux pas that pisses everyone off.
Your alternative is literally like, again, people have to be like, very tired people have to go, I now have to vote, right? And then they therefore won't vote. I tell you why God is the tipping point in which you are likely to vote, because you have to like get up and like do your religious duty as a whole. Then they say, cherry picking means it's convoluted, right? This is very funny, right? Because like firstly, religion is like the premise is that religion is like not accessible. It's not likely to be the case because churches want as much critical mass as possible. Pastors on our side are not going to just give you a thesis or a sermon that's like really out of the way. Like no one's going to give you like a university level PhD thing. They're likely to do things like, for example, youth pastors and groups and stuff. But more importantly, in the context of America, things like queer and black churches exist. On our side, the co-opting of these things means more religious buildings and more and like a lot of these like structures right, are built with these interpretations in mind. That's why in queer churches, you hear that Leviticus is something that is a verse that's taken out of context, right? In the Quran, you hear things like, for example, the verse that was used to criminalize homosexuality is actually used to criminalize pedophilia. In the Torah, abortion is legal and actually encouraged as a result, right? This is important because religion is likely to be accessible, which means they connect with God and are able to fight the good fight better. But more importantly, it counters the white narrative, right? That even if white people don't change, what you're able to say is, I as a black person can interpret the Bible this way. You can't take this away from me, right? The counterfactual is they can, because there's no opposing religious interpretation of these things. So minorities are forced to be stuck with these like individual religions. This hurts minorities as a whole, because then there's no ability for them to get right. But to the point in which that not only does it give you individual solace to be like, yes, the Bible is what I interpret it to be, and that's what my sermon says, and that child of God says, just to the point in which I'm empowered as a result. Lastly, auxiliary point on cherry picking. If everyone cherry picks, COs is out of this debate also, because ultimately there's an unlimited number of interpretations. So just pick the one that you can choose, right? So like for example, and like they're unlikely to also like infringe on other people as well, because civil rights movements, minorities, they know like each other's like struggles, right? That's all. Very proud to be on Closing Government.
All right, I'd like to thank the government whip for that fine speech, calling upon the opposition whip to wrap up the case as a whole and bring this debate to an end. Here.
All right, am I audible?
Yep, audible and visible.
Takes a second, let me organize my notes. All right, I'll take POIs verbally, and I'll preferably to enter my opening for long cross engagement, but if not closing, it's symmetrically fine. All right. Speech starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to do a couple of things in this speech. First is to explain what is the extension coming from TJ and why what responses coming from Gulf were insufficient and why this went this round. Second of all, I'm just going to bash TJ's extension directly print it out. Third of all, the opening government, and last of all, why we conclusively await opening opposition to take this round, and we need to take it first. First, what is the extension coming from TJ? It is simple. It is the strongest mechanism in this round where we explain 2 things. The first is that we told you it's empowering towards the entire movement as collective for people to realize the urgency for a change to occur. That means significant increase in lobbying. People start to stand out to actively participate in protests and actively participate in movements, and etc. Comparatively to the absence of this, you ultimately lose it on all these things on a comparatively government bench. But second of all, we talked about how you're able to unify individuals within the movement itself to put down their differences in the absence of individuals are still more or less likely to prioritize themselves or to prioritize their unique attributes. That is why individuals more or not are likely to prioritize themselves because they're selfish on their side of the housing movement is more or not fractionalized to some extent. There are a number of reasons why this is important. The first is realize there is a deadlock in the opening house. Yes, we agree that advocacy for change can happen or cannot happen. It is unclear to what extent which change is more likely to occur in OG or opening opposition, but it's only clear on our side of the house and the side of closing opposition that is in fact your compatibility to accrue and to unionize support in the collective movement as a collective through erecting a figure that is in fact your enemy. We think that is the only plausible for individuals to start to realize, to wake up and realize realize the urgency for change and henceforth start to push for it. It's only on our side you're able to do this. So the first reason is why it's so important in meta level is that it breaks the opening dialogue on this. It is only on our side to this. But in a meta level, the second reason is why this extension is important is also just it actually beats opening opposition, right? Because realize the mechanism right here is a fundamental necessity to answer opening judgments or DPM's call out or the concern about the lack of the comparative analysis coming from LOs. So insofar as opening opposition does not sufficiently show the comparative on their side of the house and why is it better, their materials are highly negative in this round and needs to come secondary. But even if there's some explanation in GLO where like they get some analysis to this, realize it is all marginal. Things like things change slightly better in the comparative of the opening opposition. Now all of these things are insignificant when the analysis TJ tells you that instrumentalizes and introduces a significant increase in the likelihood of change to materialize from the repertoire of ranges, from individuals start to give up some of their differences and start to unite on a grassroots level to a macro scale, or more individuals actively start to participate in very important processes that actually instrumentalize more change, just more lobbying and significantly more leverages on our side of the house. And these have materialized. The concern from the side of Gulfwit was, oh, this actually hurts minorities. The first response is, these people are complicit in supporting oppressed. These individuals are actually complicit and they're actually supporting an oppressive system that literally is a structural barrier towards progressive change. But the factor is that we're very happy. But second of all, even if we have to trade them off, realize that a change on our side of house is significantly more important. The first is on a quantifiable account, right? Because realize it is trading up some minorities on our side versus losing on an entire likelihood where a change to materialize that significantly elevates and significantly progresses the entirety of society as a whole. We think we're very happy to take on this trade-off whatsoever. So the factor is that CG's response is insufficient. Our extension is still winning. Let's not clash with closing government. Religion is empowering because God is literally God is literally everything and the sole life of empowering for all individuals in the front. Couple of responses. First, also just can probably attain like solace and hope other instances anyways. You have support systems to replace both things like, I don't know, like your family or like the communities are able to form within a movement and religion circles and etc. The nuance they give right here is that, oh, but God is exclusive because God is the one and the only plausible one that's the strongest hope you're able to imply. But realize, if CG wants to show this benefit, they need to show why everyone is likely to buy into it. I have two things to say. First, some people are just atheists, so the factor is that not all individuals are likely to buy into the solace of hope you're setting out. So even if there's that form of hope you're able to instill upon individuals, the factor is that a lack of buying power automatically defeats that argument. The factor is does not respond to the nuance and opening opposition, which tells you that exactly which religion you're likely to instill. Realize that some religions are just directly oppositional towards each other. Some things are just prohibited in certain religions, but some things are allowed. The factor is that there are certain collective differences between each and every single religion. So in a context in which people have different religions, you cannot just promote like a single God and like literally everyone needs to buy into it. I think that's perversely unlikely to occur. But let's be charitable. Even if you get some increase in emotional support on their side of the house, realize that it's still insignificant to the change we want to talk about. Because we told you, emotional support can be attained elsewhere, but it's only the side of closing opposition and the galvanization of support and the ability for it to entrench these forms of belief into the lives of people where people start to collectivize. We think on a scale, on a level of being exclusive, this comes secondary. But second is on a scale to which even if some people get more hope on your side of the house, it is unclear what is more important than the entirety of the change we're able to accrue and attain on the side of closing opposition, but there's an increased likelihood of manifesting on a change. Again, it's the same weighing metric. I'll suggest on a scale, we should significantly take this anyways because we're able to progress an entire change. Perhaps it is abortion laws that are able to significantly alleviate thousands of women on the ground. Perhaps it is right for LGBTQ individuals, which significantly inspires and significantly pours a significant amount of hope into individuals. But realize this is more important because a greater likelihood of change also means there is a significant it ultimately acts as a form of a premise or ultimately acts as a form of foundation for future changes to occur. So it's only at the side of closing opposition where you you increase the likelihood of change right here that people are more likely for future change. It is more likely for future changes to take place. Before I move on, I'll take opening.
So you can't win by knifing opening opposition because OO said separating is not antagonizing, and then TG says movements and moderates will demonize religion. Either you're inconsistent or haven't proven what's truer. Which is it?
The factor is unclear why it's a knife. The factor is that yes, all says separating isn't antagonizing, but the factor is that the factor is that we're not saying we're antagonizing religion. We're not saying that we're antagonizing religion. We're just saying that we're framing it as an enemy. The factor is not, and then it's just heavily unclear. So the point, but the second thing right here that we actually beat these right here is that understand if they want to get hope. The factor is that true hope is only attained, and true solace is only attained at a moment which you're able to bring a form of change that systematically uplifts the lives of all individuals on the ground. So we quote the benefit even in the absolute best case of theirs. Lastly, in opening government then, yeah, okay, so we want discussions, we want discourse. Great. It's unclear what the discourses are likely to be. Great. Opening opposition suggests a ton of reasons exactly why this is unlikely to work. Literally no comeback from DPM. The point here is that even if they get better discourse on their side, if also get more discourse, it is unclear what's the value they're able to instill. It is unclear what's the value they're able to bring to the table. So for these reasons, clearly because closing opposition uplifts, because closing opposition introduces the best forms of change and the highest likelihood of change, and that introduces life and hope for all the individuals on the ground we oppose.
I'd like to thank the opposition group for that fine speech. That brings us to an end of this round. I'd like all the 4 teams to virtually cross, and if all 3, 2, 1. Cool. So structure of the OA will go as the following. 1, general comment on the round and burdens as per the motion. 2, verdict of the House. 3, House by House analysis. Upper bench comparison, bringing in CG, bringing in CO, lower bench, and diagonal analysis. And finally, why the verdict stands as it does. Lastly, overall feedback and ways in which both the case lines could have been done, essentially. Coming to the verdict of the House, so it's a split decision. So the verdict that stands is mine. So the verdict is opening opposition, followed by closing opposition, followed by opening government, followed by closing government. Cool. The split would look like opening opposition, opening government, closing opposition, closing government. Cool. I'll just put that in the chat. Just a second. Getting right into what were the burdens as per the motion and what exactly happened during this debate. Cool. I think that when the wording is necessarily this House supports, understand that it's an analysis motion, meaning that these are value judgment debates. So at that point in time, the government teams are required to argue for the truth of the statement and the opposition teams are required to argue that it is false, right? There is no need for any sort of policy to be implemented. However, government teams should define the terms within the debate and provide a clear metric. Cool. Having said that, I think insofar as principal arguments look like, I think that you don't need to necessarily have one for like a team without one won't be penalized. And here's why. I think that insofar as principal arguments exist, the logic behind them is that if they're successfully proven, it can automatically outweigh any other effective argument, right? But I think the whole point of it is 1, how can you effectively weigh them? 2, how can you do that like insofar as your speeches are concerned, and how much do you actually like weigh them out with comparison to other speeches? Cool. I think that whenever you're trying to tell me that something is going to happen in a certain way, I necessarily need to have a likelihood analysis of the same, bringing in the propensity of change as well. That is, tell me why this is going to happen, tie it back to your main argument and impact it for me. I think that if you think about what the most important thing in the debate has become, and not what you did prepare on, but on what basis can the other teams win, you start thinking about it more and you start prioritizing your debate arguments. I think that debates generally happen in competitives, which is why that the strategy that was used by all 4 teams was relatively correct. But I think that if you do think about what the purpose of this debate is, who you're trying to protect and what problem are you trying to solve, it becomes a clearer margin for us to which side necessarily wins over the other. Cool. Just getting into the debate quickly, I think that the push that I get from opening government is that 1, if all men are created equal, if you go ahead and attach like a particular religion to a particular religious or like a civil rights movement leader, for example, MLK, I think at that point in time, they posit that if you don't attach yourself to religion, your political capital is necessarily like not going to be as valuable or as credited. But then I think you go ahead and tell me as to how integration is required because it's symbolic and familiar to people to like resonate with, and it doesn't necessarily have the burden of proof or like reason behind logic. But I think there again, I think government necessarily had to take the burden and tell me as to why, even if religion is something that doesn't necessarily need logic to be proven or doesn't necessarily need someone to buy into it for like rational reasons, I think that with respect to the civil rights movement, you definitely had to do a lot more like work with and tell me as to how it necessarily ties in tandem with the same thing. Because I think that with respect to the US, it definitely has a larger burden with regard to why is it going to be that certain religions are going to be always at the top, and why is it that people are going to buy into it at all points in time, right? Which brings me to the idea of consistency, which comes in HCO, which I'll get to in a bit. You then go ahead and tell me is how religion is always going to be controlled by like white supremacists. I think like just flagging this out now for like a general comment later on. You tell me as to how co-opting will not look as different, because then you go ahead and you avoid the ideas of separatism, and then you go ahead and shift the overturned window. Cool. You then tell me as to how people of color are going to be represented to a large like extent, because then necessarily people don't see this as separationist movements, because that would look like them going ahead and alienating people as a whole. Then you tell me as to how people participate, more buy-in, and then you get like a higher push for the agenda as a whole. But then you tell me as to how you get criticism in opposition world for being more destructive. I think like three things here. I think for you to talk about the idea of destructiveness, I think one, you have to prove as to how even if there were to be destructiveness on your world, it's not going to be as high on like on opposition's world, because like religion has like a far higher buy-in or through any methods of like characterization. But I think secondly, when you talk to me about how religion is always going to be controlled by white supremacists, it becomes important when I bring in DPM speech. DPM tells me as to how this particular civil rights movements will get tangible change on your side, because movements don't exist in monoliths, and you need to strategically use it well to your advantage. Tell me as how people of color will still support the movement. But I think here this was just a mere assertion on your end, because I don't necessarily see as to why people from different religions or people from different colors, especially talking with tandem of civil rights, are going to buy in if they've historically been subjugated and oppressed to a large extent, right? I think then you tell me as to how religions are necessarily skewed insofar as they've been historically manipulated. I think then it becomes important to flag out two things. One, how will you get opt-in if people know it's going to be necessarily skewed? Two, even if you go ahead and further create these echo chambers, how is it that the representation of minorities or representation of different colors will be more visible on government's world? I think then you go ahead and tell me as to how, since the US government is generally conservative, and looking at the Roe v. Wade judgment as a whole, you tell me how you need to infiltrate these particular structures, thereby overturning the window, and you need to reallocate your resources. You then tell me as to how the movement is unwilling to engage in opposition, and which is why it's time for compromise on your world. But I think this is what kind of like brings down OG for me, because if insofar as you're telling me that you have to go for compromise, I think that if it's run by white supremacists, I think I do not see the propensity for change ever, because I don't see as to why people will go ahead and buy into this idea if they know that like these white supremacists and elitists are never going to change their ideology or their thinking. So I think at that point in time, compromise as a whole will be far more difficult on religious ends, let alone like conservatives, right? So I think at that point in time, when you tell me as to how religion can have more impact because like, you know, it leads to them having a lot more unity, I don't think I necessarily buy into that line of argumentation, simply because your first premise is that it's led by white supremacists. So I'm unsure as to what is the impact then going to be, right? It tells me how there's an incentive for religion because they have the need to go ahead and look like saviors. And then it tells me how if you penetrate into these spaces, they'll essentially look like a lot more representation and better for like people as a whole. Cool, I think I buy that argument, but I think like I've flagged out, these are the issues that I necessarily found in OG's case. But bringing in opening opposition, I think opening opposition does a pretty good job in terms of like characterizing what their world looks like. I think this looks like two things. One, like there's no particular way as to how religious texts will be integrated, and two, how is it going to be palatable. But I think one thing here, I think opening government did not necessarily have to provide a policy or like provide a way in which the text will be integrated. That is to say that even though it is a valid concern, they necessarily did not have that particular burden. Cool. I think that opening op tells me as to how if you go ahead and look at civil rights being separate, you go ahead and attack religion as a whole, and because you say that you don't essentially like support the movement as a whole. For example, the pro-life movement. If you integrate these particular causes, you need to use more resources, more time, etc., etc. I think at that point in time, you go ahead and tell me as to how you end up picking one religion and that one particular doctrine that needs to be like followed throughout. I think this looks like you going ahead and being extremely like exclusive of a lot of other religions and races within status quo, because then you only have to like support a monolith of like a side to conform to, right? Because anytime as to how you wouldn't necessarily be able to appeal to the moderates within the US, because even though it is going through a period of change, at that point in time, the messages don't have as much meaning because they don't exclusively prove what their impact is. I think that ties back into opening government's claim of as to how all men are born equal. Because I think insofar as these quotes or these expressions exist in a vacuum, they can be believable. But when you tie it back to important social movements like the civil rights movements, you need to analyze it more and tell me as to why it's going to have a larger impact. Because I think that's when it creates a lot more propensity for change just on government's word. Cool. Opening opposition then talks to me about how there isn't a link with the direct lived experiences for like, especially for things like sexual minorities and for people of like queer genders, meaning at that point in time, you will not find it in legislation or like religion as well, right? Tell me as to how if the US has been superiorly white, you need to have credibility within these particular structures, meaning at that point in time, social movements will be seen as blasphemous to a large extent. You tell me as to how you want to reasonable support because you cherry pick what issues you want to fight for, and issues like bigotry and racism will still exist on across all spectrums. I think this argument goes uncontested towards the end of the debate as well, largely for two reasons I'll get into later. You then tell me as to how you alienate a lot of people from the civil rights movement simply because that identity is historically suppressed, and then you go ahead and delegitimize the issues that they face. I think this again wasn't contended with at all, which is why it stood. Tell me as to how you have the obligation to take care of these individuals. Cool. I think that OO's main push is to kind of create a safer space for individuals of all people of all religions, all races, all genders across the spectrum, and kind of harbor this safe space. And I think that's a pretty clever enough argumentation to go for. Cool. Second push that I get from opening opposition is that one, people will necessarily buy out from this particular idea of like religion being integrated. Two, leadership will shift. Three, people will point out like parts of the Bible which won't exactly be seen as legitimate. So even if you were to say that, oh, this isn't specifically mentioned in the Bible, people will still go ahead and point it out regardless, right? Because then you have to go ahead and appeal to people regardless of like the religion, and that would be the alternative or counterfactual, right? That means how you can use effective like legislation or like effective things like the Constitution instead of religion, because it's a standard uniform that is applicable to everyone. Then tell me as to how you can use broad narratives that appeal to everyone as well. I think a bit unclear as to this particular idea of using broad narratives that appeal to everyone, because I think that's a very generalized statement to make insofar as it exists in vacuum. I think I would need a lot more analysis as to what these broad narratives look like and how they necessarily going to create a larger impact than what government is talking about. Cool. Tell me is how you can appeal to the separation of church and state as well, meaning that the ability of state to not encroach on individuals' rights becomes far higher on your world, i.e. translate and call out mechanism. You then tell me as to how you're much likely to be more divisive because like you're going ahead and stepping on a lot of theological wires on government's word, thereby creating a lot more chaos and mayhem. I think like lastly, tell me as to how it doesn't help people of like the LGBTQ community because they then say there's no point of like actually buying into it. But I think lastly, the push that I get from opposition is that you don't, even if you get legislation passed on government, the impact is going to be not so good because one, it's tokenistic in nature, two, like you're violating your obligation towards citizens, etc., etc. I think for all these reasons, opening opposition's arguments stand throughout the debate. And now I bring in CG and CO. Cool. CG's main push is that OG asserts that, firstly, if you decrease antagonism, it essentially doesn't look like actual change, right? But I think the issue that I had with CG's case is that I found it to be a tad bit derivative from what OG has already mentioned, which I'll get to in a bit. CG tells me as to how tangible change exists for Black people as well, or like people of color. But I think that OG kind of asserts this, but doesn't necessarily impact it. But I think like it has already been mentioned. And then CG tells me as to how, considering that US is a progressive state as a whole, you tell me as to how Black people can't necessarily always access these particular resources. Meaning at that point in time, when you talk about like Black pastors going ahead and getting empowered within like status quo, it looks like you being in a place of danger and fear, but then going ahead and fighting for your own rights, right? Then you'd go ahead and tell me as to how Black pastors have social capital simply because of like their particular idea, particular narratives, etc. Then tell me as to how you go ahead and talk and speak in languages that are able to understand emotional support within communities, etc., etc. But I think like then you tell me as to how Bible supports strongly and like how minorities are going to be helped. And just a second. Okay, cool. Then you go ahead and tell me as to how Bible necessarily strongly helps minorities and individuals will show up and like galvanize the effect, right? But I think insofar as that exists, you have to necessarily prove to me as to why there's going to be a larger buy-in from minorities and from like individuals of color into these particular ideas, because I think the only assertion that I get from CG is that minorities also love religion and minorities also want to propagate the idea of God, also want to believe in that ray of hope, etc., etc. But I think at the end of the day on my sheets, that stands as mere assertion because I think the analysis part of it was kind of missing for me. But then going ahead, you tell me as to how you shut out individuals from different religions, because at that point in time, like people like atheists, etc., you essentially still have the same idea. You don't want to get shot by the police because that's just something that is abhorrently wrong. But then I think the entire power structures can be questioned. I'm unclear as to how it is necessarily going to look like. Because if power structures can be questioned, like CG posits, I think I would posit that for centuries together, if people of color have been questioning these particular power structures and no tangible changes actually accrued, I'm unsure or like unclear as to what the change is now going to look like, right? I think then CG tells me as to how you don't necessarily have to remove scriptures. And like with regard to how CG tells me as to how, even if you go ahead and say that these particular ideas of abortion isn't specifically mentioned in the Bible, people are still going to go ahead and believe it simply because it's an idea that's propagated within status quo to a large extent. So I think then CG tells me as to how, if the church is largely white, the counterfactual is that it goes unchecked, and they still use the church to justify means of like different things like say slavery, etc. Right? Then you tell me so how a lot of minorities still do love religion, and it harms religions like Islam, etc., because they are seen as those who aren't as liberal, etc., etc. But I think your main idea is that you can't bash religion simply because this is in regard to what CO brings in. You tell me as to how you can't bash it because a lot of people still believe in it. But I think then it becomes important for me to know, is religion and believing in something, or is religion and change mutually exclusive or mutually inexclusive, right? Because then I don't understand as to why you can still question a religious scripture, you can still question a power structure, but still not fight for change at the same time. Because I don't know if those two things can independently exist, or if they have to exist in like, you know, a vacuum together. But then you tell me as to onto the issue of intersectionality, you tell me as to how religion binds people together. You see people as like one identity, meaning that even if you're a different person of color, you see that, hey, you're a Christian as well. I resonate with your ideas, which is why I see a larger propensity of change. But I think again, that in itself can be a bit problematic, because historically, if you're talking about things like the Bible, if they do justify things like slavery, I think, and if that is specifically led by white supremacists, I'm unclear as to what sort of practical change is then going to be like upheld within CG as well. Because you tell me as to how, even with regard to interpretation, cherry picking examples, everyone can do that. But I think at best that is a mitigation, because even if you say that everyone can go ahead and mitigate, everyone can go ahead and cherry pick these particular examples of say, oh, but like in Roe v. Wade, like abortion isn't like illegal anymore, all of those things. You can always cherry pick things, but I don't think that necessarily impacts your argument the way you wanted it to, which is why I don't think that I can buy it necessarily with looking at what CO gives me. And lastly, coming into what CO provides to this debate, CO tells me as to how, like on all three sides, which side is going to be able to better improve social change. At that point in time, I think they necessarily mentioned that even if religion doesn't mention scripture or mention things like, oh, abortion isn't specifically mentioned, etc., you still need to go ahead and justify it, because to a large extent, people who are conservative within status quo need that sort of justification for their particular beliefs, right? At that point in time, the ability to go ahead and galvanize your protesters becomes like far higher, because you need to go ahead and sacrifice time, commitment, etc. Then you go ahead and tell me as to how a safe space that like opening opposition is talking about depends on whether or not you can keep it consistent. I think that is true, but I think the distinguishing thing that I see from OO and CO is that OO is able to better impact their arguments, and their line of argumentation is in like a consistent manner, meaning that there isn't necessarily a loophole that I can find with regard to their line of argumentation. But I think that if CO posits that a safe space can only be dependable if you can go ahead and justify keeping it consistent, I think that that's just an assertion at best. But then going ahead, you tell me how the main idea being demonization of religion and like villainizing the whole idea of like the church. It tells me as to how call out is going to be far higher on your end. And I think the example that you gave me of as to how churches who oppose gay marriage can still be called out, even though considering that gay marriage is legal within like the spectrum of USA. I think that particular example was like simple and smart, which is why like I brought the line of argumentation. It tells me as to how modern day US looks like them going ahead and appeasing Republicans. At that point in time, it becomes far higher to actually go ahead and like bind this whole thing into one binary of like which religion goes ahead to like get chosen. Then you tell me as to how the impact of it looks like. One, you can use religion as a face of evil that looks like you're making visceral change, because even within the LGBT and entire group, you tell me as to how that exists like infighting. And then if you go ahead and villainize the entire idea, you put your differences aside and you go ahead and like fight for a lot more activism, because you see each other as a united front that is going against something that divides you all. I think that was the line of argumentation that I get from CO. You then go ahead and lastly tell me to have that there exists a significant lobbying power within status quo, because if CG wants to talk about God being exclusive, CG necessarily has to talk about how, even if that exists, how are people going to buy into it knowing that they've been historically subjugated by the same like power structures as a whole, right? Because if you can't just go ahead and promote a single god, because then it leads to a lot of problematic social constructs being violated within status quo. And at that point in time, you understand how even if people were to get more hope on like government's word, it's not going to be representative of greater change, because at that point in time, buy-in to a particular narrative doesn't automatically look like them going ahead and like supporting it, because that can also reflect fence sitters just going ahead and like liking the idea of something but not actively supporting it. I think lastly, you tell me as to how even on the idea of discourse that OG presents, I think that the idea of discourse is there, but again, the idea of it being good or bad, it doesn't go like contested throughout the debate, because I think OG, again, that was another burden that you had to take on, whether change will be good or bad. Because if change, or like if discourse is going to be bad, it looks like people just going ahead and creating a lot more like chaos within society and not actually going ahead and creating any sort of like change, right? So I think at that point in time, it becomes clear to me as to the impacts of whatever OG is talking about is better like analyzed and rebutted by like CO, and like with comparison to CG. CO does a better job in telling them as to how these scriptures are going to exist regardless in a vacuum. So I think at that point in time, you can't cherry pick what you're going to propagate and what you're not going to. I think like largely for all those reasons, the verdict stands as it does. We have opening opposition, followed by closing opposition, followed by opening government, followed by closing government. Cool. So I've spent like half an hour on this and I do not have time for questions right now, but I would highly encourage all of you to reach out to the panelists as well. They had great thoughts on the same debate. We actually had to change our call multiple times and it was a super interesting debate. And yeah, I think that's about it. All the best for breaks and yeah, good luck to everyone. This was a really great and interesting debate to listen to. Thank you.